So what we are seeing is that there is tremendous potential across the board. And when ActionSA's offer is delivered with intensity and in volume over time, you can achieve those kind of results largely at the expense of the ANC.
Michael, since the last time we spoke, you've said that you're going to have a convention. ActionSA is going to have a convention in terms of setting their policies, defining their policies. Has that happened? Do you now have a clear idea of what is ActionSA's policies?
Our policy conference is taking place from the 12th to the 14th of September. We are working night and day to make sure that that is a very successful event. We have hundreds of delegates that are going to be descending upon the Birchwood Conference Centre, and I happily extend the invitation to you, Donald, to come and join us. But it is going to be a very exciting platform for us, aside from the fact that this is our foundational and inaugural policy suite, given that we were launched ahead of a local government cycle. It's also an important moment for ActionSA's maturation. We turned 3 this week, by the way. And, this policy conference and the, maturity of our democratic processes becomes an important feature of our growth. But beyond everything else, I think we've got a policy process that has lasted 8 months, and it is entirely unique from that of any other political parties we would put forward, because we have spent that time engaging the views of industry professionals and experts, so that when we talk about education, we have teachers and professors and principals and school inspectors around a table. And we've done that across every policy area in such a way that the policies we produce are going to be inherently practical, rather than the ideological navel gazing that has tended to characterize these processes and other political parties.
Can you expand on that? Why would they be practical? I mean, isn't there a possibility? We know the ANC likes to infiltrate organizations. So isn't there a possibility with democratic process that all of a sudden you're forced with expropriation without compensation?
No, certainly not. And I think it's important to understand that when you have an expert-led process, is that ultimately the party determines what we accept and what we don't. I think our point of view, though, Donald, is that when we engage in these processes, we want to see policies that are framed by experts, because when you put doctors and nurses and hospital administrators around a room and you say, how do we fix our hospitals? You don't get ideology. You don't get some politician who's never treated a patient or cured an illness. You get people who live every single day with the failures of those hospital systems, who know what has to be dealt with, but ultimately they don't have the political influence to get it done. I think our point of view is there's a lot of people in South Africa that know what needs to be done to solve our problems. They're just not in politics. And from that point of view, we don't want to see politicians who've never educated a child talking about fixing our schools. And that's why we brought those people into our processes. Without any question, some of those views that came across weren't ideologically aligned to our way of thinking. You can have as many professorships as you like. If you come here and suggest that we should become a Marxist-Leninist state, you've got to count ActionSA out of that equation, I'm afraid. But I think what we will table is inherently practical, because when you put those people around a room and you ask them about those problems, they give you solutions. And those solutions aren't ideological and they're not inherently political. They're just the things that have to be done to make those systems work. And I think that's what we want to lay down on the table, and to lay a big marker and a big distinguisher from other political parties in that process.
Michael, how does the structure within ActionSA work? Because there's been some accusation that it's sort of a dictatorship with Herman Mashaba in charge. He appoints the senators. Is that true?
Well, in a way, I suppose. So I think it's very important to understand that ActionSA just turned 3, as mentioned here. And there is an ongoing process of democratic maturation that must happen in a political party. I think you can understand that when the party was launched with just 3 people, which was in fact the case when the party began, of course, the democratic processes there were very, very narrow. I must tell you, a lot simpler, very, very narrow. But as we've gone through time, we've got a very clear roadmap and trajectory in our democratic processes. And right now, as we have it, we have a Senate, which is comprised by the national leadership and the provincial chairpersons of the 9 provinces. We have provincial executive committees that are established in all 9 provinces. We have regional executive committees that are established across 41 of the 54 districts and metros of South Africa. And certainly there is a huge number of branch executives that we are launching right across the country. In fact, one of the exciting announcements we could make this week for our birthday is that ActionSA now stands at 225,000 members, and over 30% of branches launched across South Africa's 4,468 wards. So this is a big growing party, and all the time we are deepening and increasing those decision-making processes. We certainly aren't all the way there. We aren't ashamed to say, but our elective conferences will take place after the 2024 elections. Our constitution binds us to that process. And we understand that this political party has to undergo a deep maturation of its processes to avoid a scenario where, like the EFF 10 years later, I mean, the EFF is still just one person. If we're really honest with ourselves, we don't want that. We want a diversity of leadership. We want a set of strong institutions that outlive political leaders so that ActionSA can last, because we are painfully aware that what kills new political parties are these particular issues more than anything else. And we can't let that happen to ActionSA. But fortunately, I think we have enough wisdom and experience around the table to not let it happen to ActionSA.
Michael, what do you say to those who say ActionSA is splitting the DA vote?
Well, a couple things. So, there's an extent to which that is true, because if we're very clear with ourselves, where ActionSA contests, it does win support from people who would historically have been regarded as DA supporters, a thought that I'm going to circle back to in a moment. I think if you look at the results, though, ActionSA takes far more votes from the ANC, taking over 21 or 22% of the vote across the whole of Soweto. And I need to remind you, there's more voters in Soweto than there are in the Northern Cape. So, we very clearly achieve votes from ANC. We took 9% in Seshego in Limpopo, 10.2 in KwaNongoma, 7.8 in KwaNobuhle in the Eastern Cape. So we grow at the expense of the ANC. But also what we're never going to be apologetic about, Donald, is that we are building the most diverse political party in the center of South African politics, a space that has been vacated by the DA and the ANC. The ANC has moved to the left, out EFF, the EFF. The DA has moved to the right, to out Freedom Front, the Freedom Front. And the majority of centrist voters in this country who want a diverse party are saying, well, what about us? And I think that's why ActionSA is growing so very rapidly. From our point of view, I also want to be unapologetic about something as well. The DA, nor the ANC, nor the EFF, nor anybody else do not own their voters. Voters need to decide where they believe the future of the country lies and where their support should go to further that direction. But at the end of the day, people who are with us in this election might not be in the next election. I have no claim over a voter. I have a commitment to win their support in every election. And I think the DA has gotten a bit lazy, if you don't mind me saying, because they call it our voters. And I don't think DA voters would be very pleased to know that they think that they are the property of Helen Zille. From that point of view, I think it's failed logic. And I remind you, the DA claims to be the party of a free market, and competition is the cornerstone of a free market. So let the most effective voice win. I think what matters is what will be done with those votes. And I think from an ActionSA standpoint, at least, there's an unequivocal commitment to provide an alternative to the ANC. And that's the safeguard that any vote splitting doesn't go in the wrong direction.
Why do you say the voters, that Helen Zille do not own these voters and not John Steenhuisen?
Perhaps a slip of the tongue or a Freudian area. Yeah, sure. But at the end of the day, I mean, whether it's Helen, whether it's John, the idea that DA voters should not be poached is absolute nonsense. You should have seen, Donald, when we announced our Western Cape provincial chairperson, Michelle Wasserman, a very accomplished leader, and we announced her as our candidate, as our chairperson in the Western Cape. All these DA people were outraged. I mean, you could swear this was a different country and that we would have to have, our own special application to an IEC of the Western Cape to dare consider contesting in that province. What a load of steaming you-know-what. At the end of the day, ActionSA will contest the Western Cape. We will do it unapologetically. And we will go and win votes of many, many people who don't quite believe that the Western Cape is governed wonderfully for them, or that poverty is somehow nicer in the Western Cape, or any of the absurd things that have been said in that province. And I can assure you, Donald, what I'm hearing from our teams on the ground, there are lots and lots and lots of those voters.
Yeah, it's interesting. Continuous polling showed that the majority of black voters or black residents in the Western Cape feel that DA governance has not improved their lives.
Well, I mean, you don't have to do polling to go and see this. You can go into many of those communities, and you can see it with your own eyes. And there's a very clear distinction. I think one of the reasons why this narrative of, Cape Town is governed better than anywhere else is courtesy of two things. One, I mean, that's not a very high bar if we're very honest with ourselves. I mean, that really is crawling over the lowest common denominator. Let's call it what it is. But in addition to that, people go on holiday and they're not going to Khayelitsha, Langa, and Gugulethu on holiday. They're going to Camps Bay and Sea Point and places like that, which, admittedly, you're hard pressed to go and find a pothole in those communities. But certainly, if it were the universal experience of all people that the DA was governing in the interests of everyone, the DA would be doing a hell of a lot better than the 3 or 4% that they get in support in many of those communities. And that's why ActionSA can see itself with a very helpful role in winning support in those communities and using a position in the province to advance for better service delivery for those communities.
Will ActionSA be the premier candidate? Will they have a premier in Gauteng in 2024? Will it be a Mashaba?
The discussion hasn't been had in our party. Personally would be surprised because I think Herman is going to be on the national stage. I think South Africans need an alternative to Cyril Ramaphosa, and with the greatest of respect to some of the other leaders, I think Herman is far better placed.
So Herman is going to Parliament?
Absolutely, that's the plan. We're growing a national alternative, and we don't need to equivocate or juniorize Herman to being a mayor or a premier in that regard. Certainly, that would be my opinion, but there's more discussions to be had about that in our party. But we are going to have a serious discussion about Gauteng, because ultimately, if we are frank, ActionSA has a very good chance of being the largest party in that coalition. We have every prospect of achieving that kind of result and having to supply a candidate for premier after a successful election campaign. So it is a question we are going to have to answer very seriously in this province.
Sorry. What would be some examples of ActionSA growth throughout the country?
Sure. So, I mean, we've contested many by-elections. We like by-elections because the problem with polling, Donald, is that polling does not help for a new political party. There are people who are going to vote ActionSA in 2024 that haven't heard of ActionSA as you and I are speaking right now. That's the nature of a new party. But effectively, what by-elections do is allow you to use a test case in a controlled environment where there's intense campaigning and exposure to ActionSA to see how we do. So in Ward 96 in the north of Tshwane, we went from 6% to 22% in a rural northern Afrikaans type community. In the outskirts of Soweto, from 12 to 22%. In Seshego, from a 0 base in our first competition to 9.6. In KwaNobuhle in the Eastern Cape, from 0 to 7.6. In KwaNongoma, where I must tell you, there are a few places as tough to contest as those parts of KZN, 10.2. So what we are seeing is that there is tremendous potential across the board. And when ActionSA's offer is delivered with intensity and in volume over time, you can achieve those kind of results largely at the expense of the ANC. As I mentioned earlier, I mean, we're now up to 225,000 members around the country. A third of branches launched across the country. And one of the reasons we place a premium on branches, Donald, is because unlike developed countries, in South Africa, the doorstep and the street corner are the coal faces of an election campaign. That's where most people need to be engaged. And we have invested a huge amount of time and resources in developing that infrastructure so that the policies that effectively emerge from the 12th and 14th of September may be our product, but our distribution network is going to be that huge base of volunteers that's going to deliver to the doorsteps of South Africans, because those by-elections are showing that that ActionSA is a new political party, but definitely not a small political party.
Michael, what happened to Bongani Baloyo?
Yeah, so I mean, I'll be straight with you in the perspective that Bongani was an asset to the party. I mean, I'm not going to be one of those people who, when somebody leaves, you go from being a praise singer to, hounding them out of the party and saying they were no good. Bongani is a hugely talented guy, and I think, certainly from that point of view, it was sad to see him go. But as I said to many people before, politics is a team sport, and if you ever looked at some of those videos he delivered when he left, it was very much, I did this and I did that, and I was responsible for these things. And it kind of gave you a bit of an insight into why, as the Gauteng provincial chairperson, the role he had been playing in the party, Herman had increasingly come to the view that the province wasn't going to grow to the extent that it needed to under his leadership. And Herman sat him down in what we thought was a very responsible process, saying, look, you're young, you're talented, you're a rock star in many ways, take up a role as a national spokesperson of the party and have a megaphone in that regard to be a voice for the party, which would have been very good because, without being funny, being the mayor of Midvaal on your CV is a little bit like saying I got a diligence award in junior school when you go for a job application. It's a very, very small little town. And as a potential premier candidate in 2024, Bongani needed to be a household name. A role like national spokesperson provided that platform without having any deficiencies in the leadership approach hampering our growth in Gauteng. As it is, he saw that as a slight and he left. He called it being silenced, which is a really weird thing to say when you offer someone the role of national spokesperson. It's hardly a muzzle. But, each to their own, and ActionSA is a big political party with lots and lots of leaders. So we wish Bongani all the very best, but we'll focus on ActionSA. And we're very confident that we don't live and die on the departure or arrival of any one leader.
Michael, how comfortable are you with the new Electoral Amendment Act? Because I've interviewed Dr. Anthea Jeffrey from the Institute of Race Relations, and she says the concern is the ANC can get 45% of the vote, but still get 51 representation in Parliament. Should we be concerned about this new Electoral Amendment Act?
Yeah, I think we should, and for a variety of reasons. And I'm very pleased to see some of the work that is being done by political parties and civil society in the Constitutional Court so that we can challenge those parts of the Amendment Act that are inherently problematic. It's not a secret that when legislators legislate in this country, they do so for their own narrow benefit and to ensure that they can also keep new parties out, which is a huge part of their agenda. I mean, they now require incoming political parties to go and get 60,000 signatures or something to contest elections. For ActionSA, we regard that as a good weekend's work. So that's not going to be a bit of a challenge to us. But, they are trying to protect their own interests. We see it all the time. We see it with the Party Funding Act, which is certainly something that we are taking on as a frontier. Because, really there's an effort to try and keep an incumbency in a country which rejects the incumbency. Incumbent political parties are on the decline for good reason. And they're trying to mitigate that decline by legislating their own security.
So is it true, you feel, that the ANC can get 51 representation with 45% of the vote? Is that a real thing?
It certainly would be hypothetically possible. I'd need to understand a bit more from Anthea. I often read her work and find it very impressive. So I tend to treat it credibly just off the bat. But I think certainly I'd want to have a little bit more of a look in terms of those calculations. It'll obviously have to do with how the regional and national seats are divided into those 200 and 200, etc., which is a big part of the challenge before the Constitutional Court as well. I would be surprised if it were possible to produce that kind of result, but certainly it would be good to go and look at how that conclusion is arrived at, because certainly that is a situation that has to be avoided in a country where the Constitution is explicit about the proportionality of election results.
Mm. Do you trust the IEC to have a credible result?
You really could not be barking up any further wrong tree than us. You got to remember, we were the party who they wouldn't allow us to register. And then when we did register, they wouldn't allow our name to be on the ballot paper. We contested just as a logo. So we have something of a rocky history with the IEC, which certainly we will work to improve upon going forward. But Ultimately, what we do know is that elections and their credibility comes down to the 25,000 voting stations and the people who are running those voting stations across the country and their operations management team, a lot of which in the past has proven to be problematic. But, rather than being a political party that whines about these things, the only approach is to have the best infrastructure on the ground that I can have 25,000 party agents and 25,000 voting stations, which is exactly what we are working to do. That's why we build our infrastructure across the ground. And that'll be the safeguard rather than any concerns or moans that I may have in the period between now and then.
Do you believe we can survive another 5 years of ANC rule? Do you think if they were to become a government again, in a national government in 2024, we can survive until the next election?
No, I don't know. I don't think I'm sufficiently qualified as an economist to understand those issues of resilience and collapse and to understand the precipitators, etc. What I will offer you is the following from my experience in Joburg when we worked under Herman's mayoralty. And that is probably for every year of ANC governance, it's probably going to take 5 years of fixing to reverse it and then to demonstrate the gains thereafter. And that situation probably deepens and that ratio probably worsens as we go further and further into democracy, which means the longer we take, the harder it will be to achieve those gains. I do think the South African people and the South African economy is very resilient because you've got to imagine that unlike successful countries around the world, people succeed or survive in South Africa in spite of government, not because of it. And there's many ways in which you see people adapting and innovating and doing things to ensure that they are not threatened or harmed by the failures of our government. And I think that has been a major driver of our resilience up until now. But it is no doubt that it is not sustainable. It can't continue forever. If you look at all of the key indicators, it would suggest that there has to be a cliff at some point in time. And it is our deepest hope, but more importantly, our deepest commitment that we change the leadership of this country politically before we get to that cliff. That's why we do what we do.
Okay, one question, last question. I see we're running out of time. This has nothing to do with Cape Independence, but this question is frequently asked in these polls. And I'd love to get your feedback on this because it's sort of a question I feel isn't discussed enough. In these polls, they ask, does South Africa belong equally to all who live in it? And the participants say 88% white say yes, 80% colored say yes, 31% of black people, 31, say yes, that South Africa belongs equally to all who live in it. What is your drawback on that poll? Because we keep seeing this number and it keeps dropping, that the black participants feel that South Africa does not belong equally to all who live in it.
I don't know the specific poll, and I'm actually one of the people who counsel against relying too heavily on polls in many regards, just because, the methodology employed is seldom without a political agenda in and of itself. So I would need to understand a lot more before proffering an intelligent opinion. But an unintelligent opinion that I may offer in the meantime is that I think if you were to ask all the citizens of this country, the ownership of that 31% would go up a lot higher. I think in many ways, a lot of people regard the idea of ownership of the country to all those who live in it as a provision in the Constitution that has somewhat been compromised by the extent to which illegal immigration into our country has created a dynamic where there are a huge number of people in our country who have entered our country because of the conditions in their own country. There has been no control or management of who enters our country, under what circumstances and for what reasons, and a huge failure from the part of Home Affairs to document those people. And I think if that poll were to be asked about to all the citizens, you probably find 31% would become a hell of a lot higher. But the notion of who lives in it invites a question about millions and millions of people for which many South Africans, but particularly Black South Africans who live in places where public services are under huge pressure, would probably reflect negatively upon the idea that ownership of the country should be extended to those whose presence in the country is actually a question.
Interesting. So you're saying it's sort of an anti-illegal immigrant sentiment, this poll.
I did caution you to say it's an unintelligent opinion because I haven't read the poll, understood its methodology. But if you're shining a bright light in my face and asking why did this happen, I'm offering you that opinion because what I've seen is the language belonging to all those who live in it is coming from our constitution, and many people feel that that particular language has been, abused in terms of the management of our borders and the documenting of people who are in our country legitimately or illegitimately.
Great. Fantastic. Michael, thank you so much always for your time. Is there anything you want to leave our viewers with before we conclude?
Well, certainly I'll just offer the following, and just forgive me for being the opportunist that I am. But, ActionSA is going to be contesting its first elections next year. We contested a local government election, only 6 municipalities out of 278 where we stood. Despite that, we came 6th in the country, 2.38%. And we will be contesting every one of those places in the elections next year, where we will position ActionSA as a very strong, diverse, and growing alternative to the ANC. We've committed to run an election campaign that is positive, that doesn't talk about other political parties as much as we talk about our offer. And I think South Africans are going to see something in ActionSA that they've never seen in their political landscape before. So if you'll forgive the shameless promoting, I'll leave with those words, Donald.
Great. Thank you so much, Michael. Thank you so much for your time. This has been great.
Thank you.